Well, here I hope we are. My dears, I am so looking forward to reading this story that I'm going to give you tonight. I'm not sure what happened the last couple of weeks, but something certainly went awry. I'm trying to find out the cause and to take care of it, but hopefully I'm online now and you're there. Tonight, I have the great pleasure of reading a short story by P.G. Wodehouse. That is Wodehouse, pronounced Woodhouse. His name was Pelham Grenville Wodehouse, W-O-D-E House. He was the author of almost 100 books and the creator of Jeeves. Do you remember the Jeeves and Bertie series with Stephen Fry as Jeeves and Hugh Laurie as Bertie? They were absolutely wonderful. They personified those characters. Also Blandings Castle, Uxbridge, Uncle Fred, etc. And I'm quoting now from the frontispiece here. P.G. Wodehouse was born in 1881 and educated at Dulwich College. After 2 years with the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, he became a full-time writer, contributing to a variety of periodicals, including Punch and The Globe. He married in 1914. As well as his novels and short stories, he wrote lyrics for musical comedies with Guy Bolton and Jerome Kern, and at one time had 5 musicals running simultaneously on Broadway. His time in Hollywood also provided much source material for fiction. At the age of 93, in the New Year's Honors List of 1975, he received a long overdue knighthood, only to die on St. Valentine's Day, some 45 days later. I want to give you 3 quotes about him. First, from Julian Fellows, who wrote Downton Abbey. And Gosford Park, of course. Quote, P.G. Wodehouse remains the greatest chronicler of a certain kind of Englishness that no one else has ever captured quite as sharply, or with quite so much wit and affection. From Alan Ayckbourn, a genius, elusive, delicate, but lasting. He created such a credible world that sadly, I suppose, never really existed, but what a delight it always is to enter it, and the temptation to linger there is sometimes almost overwhelming. And then finally, finally, from Simon Callow. I've recorded all the Jeeves books, and I can tell you this, it's like singing Mozart. The perfection of the phrasing is a physical pleasure. I doubt if any writer in the English language has more perfect music. And he is so witty and so delicately, what shall I say, he just hits you where it matters. And this one tonight is a rather little known one, I think, of P.G. Wodehouse. The Amazing Hat Mystery. A bean was in a nursing home with a broken leg as the result of trying to drive his sports model Poppenheim through the marble arch instead of round it. And a kindly crumpet had looked in to give him the gossip of the town. He found him playing Halma with the nurse, and he sat down on the bed and took a grape, and the bean asked what was going on in the great world. Well, said the crumpet, taking another grape, the finest minds in the drones are still wrestling with the great hat mystery. What's that? You don't mean you haven't heard about it? Not a word. The crumpet was astounded. He swallowed 2 grapes at once in his surprise. Why, London's seething with it. The general consensus of opinion is that it has something to do with the fourth dimension. You know how things go. I mean to say, something rummy occurs and you consult some big-brained bird and he wags his head and says, "Ah, the fourth dimension." Extraordinary, nobody's told you about the Great Hat mystery. You're the first visitor I've had. What is it, anyway? What hat? Well, there were two hats, reading from left to right, Percy Wimble's and Nelson Cork's. The being nodded intelligently. I see what you mean. Percy had one and Nelson had the other. Exactly. Two hats in one, top hats. What was mysterious about them? Why, Elizabeth Botsworth and Diana Punter said they didn't fit. Well, hats don't sometimes. But these came from Bodmin's. The bean shot up in bed. What? You mustn't excite the patient, said the nurse, who up to this time had taken no part in the conversation. But, dash it, nurse, cried the bean, you can't have caught what he said. If we are to give credence to his story, Percy Wimbold and Nelson Cork bought a couple of hats at Bodmin's. At Bodmin's, I'll trouble you. And they didn't fit. It isn't possible. He spoke with strong emotion, and the crumpet nodded understandingly. People can say what they please about the modern young man believing in nothing nowadays, but there is something every right-minded young man believes in, and that is the infallibility of Bodmin's hats. It is one of the eternal verities. Once admit that it is possible for a Bodmin hat not to fit, and you leave the door open for doubt, schism, and chaos generally. That's exactly how Percy and Nelson felt, and it was for that reason they were compelled to take the strong line they did take with E. Botsworth and D. Punter. They took a strong line, did they? A very strong line. Won't you tell the whole story from the beginning? Said the nurse. Right-o, said the crumpet, taking a grape. It'll make your head swim. So mysterious? So absolutely dashed uncanny from start to finish. You must know, my dear old nurse, said the crumpet, that these two blokes, Percy Wimbold and Nelson Cork, are fellows who have to exercise the most watchful care about their lids, because they are so situated that in their case there can be none of that business of just barging into any old hattery and grabbing the first thing in sight. Percy is one of those large, stout, outsized chaps with a head like a watermelon, while Nelson is built more on the lines of a minor jockey and has a head like a peanut. You will readily appreciate, therefore, that it requires an artist's hand to fit them properly, and that is why they have always gone to Bodmin. I have heard Percy say that his trust in Bodmin is like the unspotted faith of a young curate in his bishop. And I have no doubt that Nelson would have said the same if he had thought of it. It was at Bodmin's door that they ran into each other on the morning when my story begins. Hello, said Percy. You come to buy a hat? Yes, said Nelson. You come to buy a hat? Yes, said Percy, glancing cautiously about him, saw that he was alone, except for Nelson, of course, and unobserved, and drew closer and lowered his voice. There's a reason. That's rummy, said Nelson. He also spoke in a hushed tone. I have a special reason, too. Percy looked warily about and lowered his voice another notch. Nelson, he said. You know Elizabeth Botsworth? Intimately, said Nelson. Rather a sound young potato, what? Very much so. Pretty. I've often noticed it. Me too. She is so small, so sweet, so dainty, so lively, so... what's the word? That a fellow wouldn't be far right in calling her an angel in human shape. Aren't all angels in human shape? Are they? Said Percy, who was a bit foggy on angels. Well, be that as it may, he went on, his cheeks suffused to a certain extent. I love that girl, Nelson, and she's coming with me to the first day of Ascot, and I'm relying on this new hat of mine to do just that extra bit that's needed in the way of making her reciprocate my passion. Having only met her so far at country houses, I've never yet flashed upon her in a topper. Nelson Cork was staring. Well, if that isn't the most remarkable coincidence I ever came across in my puff, he exclaimed, amazed. I'm buying my new hat for exactly the same reason. A convulsive start shook Percy's massive frame. His eyes bulged. To fascinate Elizabeth Botsworth? He cried, beginning to writhe. No, said Nelson soothingly. Of course not. Elizabeth and I have always been great friends, but nothing more. What I meant was that I, like you, am counting on this forthcoming topper of mine to put me across with the girl I love. Percy stopped writhing. Who is she? He asked, interested. Diana Punter, the niece of my godmother, Omar Punter. It's an odd thing. I've known her all my life, brought up as kids together and so forth, and it's only recently that passion has burgeoned. I now worship that girl, Percy, from the top of her head to the soles of her divine feet. Percy looked dubious. That's a pretty longish distance, isn't it? Diana Punter is one of my closest friends and a charming girl in every respect, but isn't she a bit tall for you, old man? My dear chap, that's what I admire so much about her, her superb statuesqueness, more like a Greek goddess than anything I've struck for years. Besides, she isn't any taller for me than you are for Elizabeth Botsworth. True, admitted Percy. And anyway, I love her, blast it. And I don't propose to argue the point. I love her, I love her, I love her. And we are lunching together the first day of Ascot. At Ascot? No, she isn't keen on racing, so I shall have to give Ascot a miss. That's love, said Percy, awed. The binge will take place at my godmother's house in Berkeley Square, and it won't be long after that, I feel, before you see an interesting announcement in the Morning Post. Percy extended his hand. Nelson grasped it warmly. These new hats are pretty well bound to do the trick, I should say, wouldn't you? Infallibly. Where girls are concerned, there is nothing that brings home the gravy like a well-fitting topper. Bodmin must extend himself as never before, said Percy. He certainly must, said Nelson. They entered the shop, and Bodmin, having measured them with his own two hands, promised that two of his very finest efforts should be at their respective addresses in the course of the next few days. Now, Percy Winbolt isn't a chap you would suspect of having nerves. But there is no doubt that in the interval which elapsed before Bodmin was scheduled to deliver, he got pretty twittery. He kept having awful visions of some great disaster happening to his new hat. And as things turned out, these visions came jolly near being fulfilled. It has made Percy feel that he is psychic. What occurred was this. Owing to these jitters of his, he hadn't been sleeping any too well, and on the morning before Ascot he was up as early as 10:30, and he went to his sitting room window to see what sort of a day it was, and the sight he beheld from that window absolutely froze the blood in his veins. For there below him, strutting up and down the pavement, were a uniformed little blighter, whom he recognized as Bodmin's errand boy, and an equally foul kid in mufti. And balanced on each child's loathsome head was a top hat. Against the railings were leaning a couple of cardboard hat boxes. Now, considering that Percy had only just woken from a dream in which he had been standing outside the Guildhall in his new hat, receiving the freedom of the city from the Lord Mayor, and the Lord Mayor had suddenly taken a terrific swipe at the hat with his mace, knocking it into hash, you might have supposed that he would have been hardened to something. But he wasn't. His reaction was terrific. There was a moment of sort of paralysis during which he was telling himself that he had always suspected this beastly little boy of Bodmin's of having a low and frivolous outlook and being temperamentally unfitted for his high office. And then he came alive with a jerk and let out probably the juiciest yell the neighborhood had heard for years. It stopped the striplings like a high-powered shell. One moment they had been swanking up and down in a mincing and affected sort of way. The next, the second kid had legged it like a streak, and Bodmin's boy was shoving the hats back in the boxes and trying to do it quickly enough to enable him to be elsewhere when Percy should arrive. And in this he was successful. By the time Percy had got to the front door and opened it, there was nothing to be seen but a hat box standing on the steps. He took it up to his flat and removed the contents with a gingerly and reverent hand, holding his breath for fear the nap should have got rubbed the wrong way, or a dent of any nature been made in the gleaming surface. But apparently all was well. Bodmin's boy might sink to taking hats out of their boxes and fooling about with them, but at least he hadn't gone to the last awful extreme of dropping them. The lid was okay, absolutely. And on the following morning, Percy, having spent the interval polishing it with stout, assembled the boots, the spats, the trousers, the coat, the flowered waistcoat, the collar, the shirt, the quiet grey tie, and the good old gardenia, and set off in a taxi for the house where Elizabeth was staying. And presently he was ringing the bell and being told she would be down in a minute, and eventually down she came, looking perfectly marvelous. "What ho, what ho," said Percy. "Hello, Percy," said Elizabeth. Well, naturally, up to this moment, Percy had been standing with bared head. At this point, he put the hat on. He wanted her to get the full effect suddenly, in a good light, and very strategic, too. I mean to say it would have been the act of a Juggins to have waited till they were in a taxi, because in a taxi, all toppers look alike. So Percy popped the hat on his head with a meaning glance and stood waiting for the uncontrollable round of applause. And instead of clapping her little hands in girlish ecstasy and doing spring dancing round him, this young Betsworth gave a sort of gurgling scream, not unlike a coloratura soprano choking on a fishbone. Then she blinked and became calmer. "It's all right," she said. "The momentary weakness has passed. Tell me, Percy, when do you open?" "Open?" said Percy, not having the remotest. "On the halls. Aren't you going to sing comic songs on the music halls?" Percy's perplexity deepened. "Me? No, how? Why? What do you mean?" "I thought that hat must be part of the makeup and that you were trying it on the dog. I couldn't think of any other reason that you should wear one 6 sizes too small." Percy gasped. "You aren't suggesting this hat doesn't fit me?" "It doesn't fit you by a mile." "But it's a Bodmin. Call it what you like. I call it a public outrage." Percy was appalled. "I mean, naturally. A nice thing for a chap to give his heart to a girl and then find her talking in this hideous, flippant way of sacred subjects." Then it occurred to him that, living all the time in the country, she might not have learned to appreciate the holy significance of the name Bodmin. "Listen," he said gently. "Let me explain. This hat was made by the world-famous hatter of Vigo Street. He measured me in person and guaranteed a fit. And I nearly had one. And if Bodmin guarantees that a hat shall fit," proceeded Percy, trying to fight against a sickening sort of feeling that he had been all wrong about this girl, "it fits. I mean, saying a Bodmin hat doesn't fit is like saying, well, I can't think of anything awful enough. That hat's awful enough. It's like something out of a two-reel comedy. Pure Charles Chaplin. I know a joke's a joke, Percy, and I'm as fond of a laugh as anyone, but there is such a thing as cruelty to animals. Imagine the feelings of the horses at Ascot when they see that hat." Poets and other literary blokes talk a lot about falling in love at first sight, but it's equally possible to fall out of love just as quickly. One moment this girl was the be-all and the end-all, as you might say, of Percy Wimbled's life. The next, she was just a regrettable young blister with whom he wished to hold no further communication. He could stand a good deal from the sex. Insults directed at himself left him unmoved, but he was not prepared to countenance destructive criticism. He was not prepared to countenance destructive criticism of a Bodmin hat. "Possibly," he said coldly, "you would prefer to go to this ballet race meeting alone." "You bet I'm going alone. You don't suppose I mean to be seen in broad daylight in the paddock at Ascot with a hat like that?" Percy stepped back and bowed formally. "Drive on, driver," he said to the driver, and the driver drove on. Now, you would say that that was rummy enough. A full-size mystery in itself, you might call it. But wait, mark the sequel. You haven't heard anything yet. We now turn to Nelson Cork. Shortly before 1:30, Nelson had shoved over to Berkeley Square and had lunch with his godmother and Diana Punter, and Diana's manner and deportment had been absolutely all that could have been desired. In fact, so chummy had she been over the cutlets and fruit salad that it seemed to Nelson that if she was like this now, imagination boggled at the thought of how utterly all over him she would be when he sprang his new hat on her. So when the meal was concluded and coffee had been drunk, and old Lady Punter had gone up to her boudoir with a digestive tablet and a sex novel, He thought it would be a sound move to invite her to come for a stroll along Bond Street. There was the chance, of course, that she would fall into his arms right in the middle of the pavement. But if that happened, he told himself, they could always get into a cab. So he mooted the saunter, and she checked up, and presently they started off. And you will scarcely believe this, but they hadn't gone more than halfway along Bruton Street when she suddenly stopped and looked at him in an odd manner. "I don't want to be personal, Nelson," she said, "but really I do think you ought to take the trouble to get measured for your hats." If a gas main had exploded beneath Nelson's feet, he could scarcely have been more taken aback. He gasped. He could scarcely believe that he had heard aright. "It's the only way with a head like yours. I know it's a temptation for a lazy man to go into a shop and just take whatever is offered him, but the result is so sloppy. The thing you're wearing now looks like an extinguisher." Nelson was telling himself that he must be strong. "Are you endeavoring to intimate that this hat does not fit? Can't you feel that it doesn't fit?" "But it's a Bodman." "I don't know what you mean. It's just an ordinary silk hat." "Not at all. It's a Bodman." "I don't know what you are talking about." "The point I am trying to drive home," said Nelson stiffly, "is that this hat was constructed under the personal auspices of John Bodman of Vigo Street." "Well, it's too big." "It is not too big. I say it is too big." Excuse me. "And I say a Bodman hat cannot be too big." "Well, I've got eyes, and I say it is." Nelson controlled himself with an effort. "I would be the last person," he said, "to criticize your eyesight, but on the present occasion you will permit me to say that it has let you down with a considerable bump. Myopia is indicated." "Allow me," said Nelson, hot under the collar, but still dignified, "to tell you something about John Bodman, as the name appears new to you. John is the last of a long line of Bodmans, all of whom have made hats assiduously for the nobility and gentry all their lives. Hats are in John Bodman's blood." "I don't..." Nelson held up a restraining hand. Over the door of his emporium in Vigo Street, the passers-by may read a significant legend. It runs, "Bespoke hatter to the royal family." That means, in simple language adapted to the lay intelligence, that if the king wants a new topper, he simply ankles round to Bodman's and says, "Good morning, Bodman, we want a topper." He does not ask if it will fit. He takes it for granted that it will fit. He has bespoken John Bodman, and he trusts him blindly. Excuse me. "You don't suppose His Gracious Majesty would bespeak a hatter whose hats did not fit? The whole essence of being a hatter is to make hats that fit, and it is to this end that John Bodman has strained every nerve for years, and that is why I say again, simply and without heat, this hat is a Bodman." Diana was beginning to get a bit peeved. The blood of the punters is hot, and very little is required to steam it up. She tapped Bruton Street with a testy foot. "You always were an obstinate, pig-headed little fiend, Nelson, even as a child. I tell you once more for the last time that that hat is too big. If it were not for the fact that I can see a pair of boots and part of a pair of trousers, I should not know that there was a human being under it. I don't care how much you argue, I still think you ought to be ashamed of yourself for coming out in the thing. Even if you didn't mind for your own sake, you might have considered the feelings of the pedestrians and traffic. Nelson quivered. You do you? Yes, I do. Oh, you do? I said I did. Didn't you hear me? No, I suppose you could hardly be expected to, with an enormous great hat coming down over your ears. You say this hat comes down over my ears? Right over your ears. It's a mystery to me why you think it worthwhile to deny it. I fear what follows does not show Nelson Cork in the role of a parfait genteel knight, but in extenuation of his behavior. I must remind you that he and Diana Punter had been brought up as children together, and a dispute between a couple who have shared the same nursery is always liable to degenerate into an exchange of personalities and innuendos. What starts as an academic discussion on hats turns only too swiftly into a raking up of old sores and a grand parade of family skeletons. It was so in this case. At the word mystery, Nelson uttered a nasty laugh. A mystery, eh? As much a mystery, I suppose, as why your Uncle George suddenly left England in the year 1920 without stopping to pack up. Diana's eyes flashed. Her foot struck the pavement another shrewd wallop. Uncle George, she said haughtily, went abroad for his health. You bet he did, retorted Nelson. He knew it was good for him. Anyway, he wouldn't have worn a hat like that. Where they would have put him if he hadn't been off like a scalded kitten, he wouldn't have worn a hat at all. A small groove was now appearing in the pavement stone on which Diana Punter stood. Well, Uncle George escaped one thing by going abroad, at any rate, she said. He missed the big scandal about your Aunt Clarissa in 1922. Nelson clenched his fists. The jury gave Aunt Clarissa the benefit of the doubt, he said hoarsely. Well, we all know what that means. It was accompanied, if you recollect, by some very strong remarks from the bench. There was a pause. I may be wrong, said Nelson, but I should have thought it ill beseemed a girl whose brother Cyril was warned off the turf in 1924 to haul up her slacks about other people's Aunt Clarissas. Passing lightly over my brother Cyril in 1924, rejoined Diana, what price your cousin Fred in 1927? They glared at one another in silence for a space, each realizing with a pang that the supply of erring relatives had now given out. Diana was still pawing the paving stone, and Nelson was wondering what on earth he could ever have seen in a girl who, in addition to talking subversive drivel about hats, was 8 feet tall and ungainly to boot. While, as for your brother-in-law's niece's sister-in-law, Muriel, began Diana, suddenly brightening. I prefer not to continue this discussion, Nelson checked her with a gesture. It is no pleasure to me, replied Diana with equal coldness, to have to listen to your vapid gibberings. That's the worst of a man who wears his hat over his mouth. He will talk through it. I bid you a very hearty good afternoon, Miss Punter, said Nelson. He strode off without a backward glance. Now, one advantage of having a row with a girl in Bruton Street is that the drones is only just around the corner, so that you can pop in and restore the old nervous system with the minimum of trouble. Nelson was round there in what practically amounted to a trice, and the first person he saw was Percy, hunched up over a double and splash. "Hello," said Percy. "Hello," said Nelson. There was a silence, broken only by the sound of Nelson ordering a mixed vermouth. Percy continued to stare before him, like a man who has drained the wine cup of life to its lees, only to discover a dead mouse at the bottom. "Nelson," he said at length, "what are your views on the modern girl?" "I think she's a mess." "I thoroughly agree with you," said Percy. "Of course, Diana Punter is a rare exception, but apart from Diana, I wouldn't give you tuppence for the modern girl. She lacks depth and reverence and has no sense of what is fitting. Hats, for example." "Exactly. But what do you mean Diana Punter is an exception? She's one of the ringleaders, the spearhead of the movement, if you like to put it that way." "Think," said Nelson, sipping his vermouth, "of all the unpleasant qualities of the modern girl. Add them up, double them, and what have you got? Diana Punter. Let me tell you what took place between me and this Punter only a few minutes ago." "No," said Percy, "let me tell you what transpired between me and Elizabeth Botsworth this morning." "Nelson, old man, she said my hat, my Bodmin hat, was too small." "You don't mean that?" "Those were her very words." "Well, I'm dashed. Listen, Diana Punter told me my equally Bodmin hat was too large." They stared at one another. "It's the spirit of something," said Nelson. "I don't know what quite, but of something. You see it on all sides. Something very serious has gone wrong with girls nowadays. There is lawlessness and license abroad. And here in England, too." "Well, naturally, you silly ass," said Nelson with some asperity. "When I said abroad, I didn't mean abroad. I meant abroad." He mused for a moment. "I must say, though," he continued, "I am surprised at what you tell me about Elizabeth Botsworth, and inclined to think there must have been some mistake. I have always been a warm admirer of Elizabeth. And I have always thought Diana one of the best, and I find it hard to believe that she should have shown up in such a dubious light as you suggest. Probably there was a misunderstanding of some kind." "Well, I ticked her off properly, anyway." Percy Wimbold shook his head. "You shouldn't have done that, Nelson. You may have wounded her feelings. In my case, of course, I had no alternative but to be pretty crisp with Elizabeth." Nelson Cork clicked his tongue. "A pity," he said. "Elizabeth is sensitive." "So is Diana." "Not so sensitive as Elizabeth. I should say, at a venture, about 5 times as sensitive as Elizabeth. However, we must not quarrel about a point like that, old man. The fact that emerges is that we both seem to have been badly treated. I think I shall toddle home and take an aspirin." "Me too." They went off to the cloakroom where their hats were, and Percy put his on. "Surely," he said, "nobody but a half-witted little pipsqueak who can't see straight would say this was too small." "It isn't a bit too small," said Nelson. "And take a look at this one. Am I not right in supposing that only a female giantess with straws in her hair and astigmatism in both eyes could say it was too large? It's a lovely fit." And the cloakroom waiter, a knowledgeable chap by the name of Robinson, said the same. "So there you are," said Nelson. Ah, well, said Percy. They left the club and parted at the top of Dover Street. Now, though he had not said so in so many words, Nelson Cork's heart had bled for Percy Wimbold. He knew the other's fine sensibilities, and he could guess how deeply they must have been gashed by this unfortunate breaking off of diplomatic relations with the girl he loved. For whatever might have happened, however sorely he might have been wounded, the way Nelson Cork looked at it was that Percy loved Elizabeth Botsworth in spite of everything. What was required here, felt Nelson, was a tactful mediator, a kindly, sensible friend of both parties who could hitch up his socks and plunge in and heal the breach. So the moment he had got rid of Percy outside the club, he hared round to the house where Elizabeth was staying and was lucky enough to catch her on the front doorsteps. For naturally, Elizabeth hadn't gone off to Ascot by herself. Directly Percy was out of sight, she had told the taxi man to drive her home. And she had been occupying the intervals since the painful scene in thinking of things she wished she had said to him and taking her hostess's dog for a run. A Pekingese called Clarkson. She seemed very pleased to see Nelson and started to prattle of this and that, her whole demeanor that of a girl who, after having been compelled to associate for a while with the underworld, has at last found a kindred soul. And the more he listened, the more he wanted to go on listening. And the more he looked at her, the more he felt that a lifetime spent in gazing at Elizabeth Botsworth would be a lifetime dashed well spent. There was something about the girl's exquisite petiteness and fragility that appealed to Nelson Cork's depths. After having wasted so much time looking at a female chimera like Diana Punter, it was a genuine treat to him to be privileged to feast the eyes on one so small and dainty. And what with one thing and another, he found the most extraordinary difficulty in lugging Percy into the conversation. They strolled along, chatting, and mark you, Elizabeth Botsworth was a girl a fellow could chat with without getting a crick in the neck from goggling up at her, the way you had to do when you took the air with Diana Punter. Nelson realized now that talking to Diana Punter had been like trying to exchange thoughts with a flagpole sitter. He was surprised that this had never occurred to him before. You know, you're looking perfectly ripping, Elizabeth, he said. How funny, said the girl. I was just going to say the same thing about you. Not really. Yes, I was. After some of the gargoyles I've seen lately, Percy Wimbold is an example that springs to the mind. It's such a relief to be with a man who really knows how to turn himself out. Now that the Percy motif had been introduced, it should have been a simple task for Nelson to turn the talk to the subject of his absent friend, but somehow he didn't. Instead, he just simpered a bit and said, "Oh, no, I say, really, do you mean that?" "I do indeed," said Elizabeth earnestly. "It's your hat, principally, I think. I don't know why it is, but ever since a child, I have been intensely sensitive to hats. And it has always been a pleasure to me to remember that at the age of 5, I dropped a pot of jam out of the nursery window onto my Uncle Alexander when he came to visit us in a deerstalker cap with ear flaps, as worn by Sherlock Holmes. I consider the hat the final test of a man. Now yours is perfect. I never saw such a beautiful fit. I can't tell you how much I admire that hat. It gives you quite an ambassadorial look." Nelson Cork drew a deep breath. He was tingling from head to foot. It was as if the scales had fallen from his eyes and a new life had begun for him. "I say," he said, trembling with emotion, "I wonder if you would mind if I pressed your little hand." "Do," said Elizabeth cordially. "I will," said Nelson, and did so. "And now," he went on, clinging to the fin like glue and hiccuping a bit, "how about buzzing off somewhere for a quiet cup of tea? I have a feeling that we have much to say to one another." It is odd how often it happens in this world that when there are two chaps and one chap's heart is bleeding for the other chap, you find that all the while the second chap's heart is bleeding just as much for the first chap. Both bleeding, I mean to say, not only one. It was so in the case of Nelson Cork and Percy Wimbold. The moment he had left Nelson, Percy charged straight off in search of Diana Punter with the intention of putting everything right with a few well-chosen words. Because what he felt was that, though at the actual moment of going to press, pique might be putting Nelson off Diana, this would pass off, and love would come into its own again. All that was required, he considered, was a suave go-between, a genial mutual pal who would pour oil on the troubled W's and generally fix things up. He found Diana walking round and round Berkeley Square with her chin up, breathing tensely through the nostrils. He drew up alongside and "what-ode?" And as she beheld him, the cold, hard gleam in her eyes changed to a light of cordiality. She appeared charmed to see him, and at once embarked on an animated conversation. And with every word she spoke, his conviction deepened that of all the ways of passing a summer afternoon, there was none fruitier than having a friendly hike with Diana Punter. And it was not only her talk that enchanted him. He was equally fascinated by that wonderful physique of hers. When he considered that he had actually wasted several valuable minutes that day conversing with a young shrimp like Elizabeth Botsworth, he could have kicked himself. Here, he reflected, as they walked round the square, was a girl whose ear was more or less on a level with a fellow's mouth, so that such observations as he might make were enabled to get from point to point with the least possible delay. Talking to Elizabeth Botsworth had always been like bellowing down a well in the hope of attracting the attention of one of the smaller infusoria at the bottom. It surprised him that he had been so long in coming to this conclusion. He was awakened from this reverie by hearing his companion utter the name of Nelson Cork. "I beg your pardon?" he said. "I was saying," said Diana, "that Nelson Cork is a wretched little undersized blob who, if he were not too lazy to work, would long since have signed up with some good troop of midgets." "Oh, would you say that?" "I would say more than that," said Diana firmly. "I tell you, Percy, that what makes life so ghastly for girls, what causes girls to get gray hair and go into convents, is the fact that it is not always possible for them to avoid being seen in public with men like Nelson Cork. I trust I am not uncharitable. I try to view these things in a broad-minded way, saying to myself that if a man looks like something that has come out from under a flat stone, it is his misfortune rather than his fault, and that he is more to be pitied than censured. But on one thing I do insist, that such a man does not wantonly aggravate the natural unpleasantness of his appearance by prancing about London in a hat that reaches down to his ankles. I cannot and will not endure being escorted along Bruton Street by a sort of human bacillus the brim of whose hat bumps on the pavement with every step he takes. What I have always said, and what I shall always say, is that the hat is the acid test. A man who cannot buy the right-sized hat is a man one could never like or trust. Your hat now, Percy, is exactly right. I have seen a good many hats in my time, but I really do not think that I have ever come across a more perfect specimen of all that a hat should be. Not too large, not too small, fitting snugly to the head like the skin on a sausage. And you have just the kind of head that a silk hat shows off. It gives you a sort of look, how shall I describe it? It conveys the idea of a master of men. Leonine is the word I want. There is something about the way it rests on the brow and the almost imperceptible tilt towards the southeast. Percy Wimbold was quivering like an oriental muscle dancer. Soft music seemed to be playing from the direction of Hay Hill, and Berkeley Square had begun to skip around him on one foot. He drew a deep breath. "I say," he said, "stop me if you've heard this before, but what I feel we ought to do at this juncture is to dash off somewhere where it's quiet and where there aren't so many houses dancing the Blue Danube, and shove some tea into ourselves. And over the pot and muffins, I shall have something very important to say to you." So that, concluded the Crumpet, taking a grape, is how the thing stands. And in a sense, of course, you could say that it is a very satisfactory ending. The announcement of Elizabeth's engagement to Nelson Cork appeared in the press on the same day as that of Diana's projected hitching up with Percy Wimbold. And it is pleasant that the happy couple should be so well matched as regards size. I mean to say, there'll be none of that business of a 6-foot girl tripping down the aisle with a 5'4" man, or a 6'2" man trying to keep step along the sacred edifice with a 4'3" girl. That is always good for a laugh from the ringside pews, but it does not make for wedded bliss. No, so far as the principals are concerned, we may say that all has ended well. But that doesn't seem to me to be the important point. What seems to me the important point is this extraordinary, baffling mystery of those hats. "Absolutely," said the Bean. "I mean to say, if Percy's hat really didn't fit, as Elizabeth Botsworth contended, why should it have registered as a winner with Diana Punter?" "Absolutely," said the Bean. "And conversely, if Nelson's hat was the total loss which Diana Punter considered it, why, only a brief while later, was it going like a breeze with Elizabeth Botsworth?" "Absolutely," said the Bean. "The whole thing is utterly inscrutable." It was at this point that the nurse gave signs of wishing to catch the speaker's eye. "Shall I tell you what I think?" "Say on, my dear young pillow smoother." "I believe Bodman's boy must have got those hats mixed, when he was putting them back in the boxes, I mean." The Crumpet shook his head and took a grape. "And then at the club, they got the right ones again." The Crumpet smiled indulgently. "Ingenious," he said, taking a grape. "Quite ingenious, but a little far-fetched. No, I prefer to think the whole thing, as I say, has something to do with the fourth dimension. I am convinced that that is the true explanation, if our minds could only grasp it." "Absolutely," said the Bean. And that is The Amazing Hat Mystery by P.G. Wodehouse. One of so many absolutely delicious short stories. and the novels as well, Blandings, and I mean, it's just, it's just a world of treasures, and so gentle, gentle, gentle English humor. I hope you've enjoyed it. I loved reading it. I'm a little bouleversée today, I think, because of the heat, but I hope I've managed to bring it over sufficiently for you to enjoy it. If so, that is it, my dears, for Tales and Cocktails for tonight. And I trust there was no difficulty in this broadcasting tonight. If not, great. And I will see you next Wednesday at 6 o'clock for Tales and Cocktails. Thank you, one and all.